So hi you guys, good evening or good morning or whatever time you're in right now, and welcome to the recap tutoring session for macroeconomics. I have to say that this tutoring will be based on the course of Professor Lopez, which I know is maybe different from other courses. Therefore, I will be sorry if you're from another course and I can't answer your question to a topic that we didn't cover or anything. But maybe we'll see. Maybe somebody else from this session today can help you. But without further ado, let's go into the tutoring. I split the tutoring in 3 different chapters and also the PowerPoint presentation, which you can find on our website. It's 3 different chapters for all the 3 different topics that will be on the midterms. We will first start with the main concept. Afterwards, we will look at the Keynesian model. And thirdly, we'll look at the money chapter. Okay, so let's start with the first chapter, which will be the main concepts, which is split into 4 additional small chapters. Okay, first things first, some theory. Let's talk about the economic actors. On the PowerPoint slide that you can see, you see our 5 main economic actors, which would be the government, the households, the firms, the financial institution, and of course the rest of the world. You will have listed their main functions in the economy. It's basic theory, and I don't think I need to go really further into this because it's quite self-explanatory and you will have the slides. So I will move on to more complex stuff. So here we have the circular flow, and the circular flow actually describes how these 5 actors from the economy interact with each other. However, here we haven't included the rest of the world yet, because it's a very simplified model, and maybe we will have a look at it later on in the semester, maybe not, but we'll see. However, from this circular flow, something that is also important to remember is that we actually can also find GDP. We will look at GDP afterwards more in depth, but just for now, I think all of you are familiar with GDP, so I can say it already now how you can interpret this circular flow. So you can actually find 2 different GDPs in this graphic right now, namely the with the income method and also with the expenditure method. So first we can look at the income method. Income method, I will look at it afterwards more in depth, but income method is just all the income together summed up, which would be profit, interest, and salaries. And if you see from this circular flow, here will be the salaries, right? And then we have also interests. Well, salaries are here, interests are here. We actually don't see the profit, but it's not on here. So actually, this will be our GDP, which will be equal to 1,000. The other method that we can use, as I told you, would be the expenditure method, which would be the normal GDP thing that we know, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus z. However, because we don't have a government here, neither we don't have the rest of the world, so no x and z. It actually only depends on c and I. And as you can see, c consumption is here 700, and I investments is here on this side, which would be 300. 300 plus 700, again 1,000. And as we know, GDP always has to be the same. Therefore, yeah, that's the main point actually of the circular flow, and also, of course, to understand how the different actors interact in the economy. So yeah, that's all about the circular flow. Let's move on to the next slide, which would actually bring us to a main topic from the main concept, namely the national accounting. National accounting is mostly just about how to calculate the GDP. And for GDP calculation, for now, we looked at the 3 main methods, which would be firstly the value added or production method, the income method, and the expenditure method. For the value added method, I wrote down here what you have to do in order to find GDP. So you have two options actually. First option would be you sum up all the value added from your goods and services produced in the economy. That would be the whole value added, therefore GDP. First method. Second method, you can sum up the turnover and minus all the intermediary purchases and consumption of each sector in order to get also the value added. So we can say that also turnover minus intermediary consumption, purchases, same thing, would be equal to the value added. Okay, so that would be the first method. Second method would be the income method. Income method is just sum up all the incomes received in an economy. And here again, you see the calculations. So we have incomes in terms of labor remunerations. Sorry about the word, I can't pronounce it. And secondly, we have capital remuneration. For the labor remuneration, we have included salaries and as well profit. Salaries would be the income of workers, profit income of firms. That should be NI, sorry for that, firms. And for the capital remuneration, we would have interest, so capital, which would be the income of financial institution. And that would be the income method. And as you know, for all three calculations, we need to get the same number. It will always be the same GDP, otherwise something went wrong. Then the last but not least important method is the expenditure or spending method, where we have our also beloved macroeconomic equation. Very important to remember. It's y is equal to c plus g plus x minus z, which would be actually also aggregate supply. Be here is equal to aggregate demand. Okay. I will go a little bit deeper into this right in the next slide, just so to get a small recap, but I think we're all familiar with it. But yeah, these are basically the three main ways how to calculate GDP. And you have it on the slides here. So again, as I said, we look a little bit more at the expenditure method, just at the different elements. So that C is consumption, Y is investments, G is government expenditure, X is export, and Z is imports. Something to remember about, for example, these three, this would be the domestic demand theory, X would be the external demand, and Z are just the purchases from foreign goods and services markets. And just always remember that Z will always be subtracted from this method. Yeah. Okay. That would be the expenditure method. Let's move on to the next slide, namely the in and output matrix. Well, this in and output matrix is actually just a quite convenient way to calculate GDP with the three different methods, because here you have summarized all of the different numbers that we need for the calculation of this. I hope you're all familiar with it by now. However, I give you a small explanation of it with the three different methods to use. So let's first look at the value added method. It will be total production minus the total intermediary purchases. Total production can, in this case, also be associated with total turnover. And so total production, as we see, is 136, which is this number and this number. These two together minus all the intermediary purchases. The intermediary purchases are these, all of these together. So actually what you do, you sum these two, you sum these four, subtract them, and you get 291. That would be the added value method. Then let's go to the income method. Income method, I told you, we sum up all the incomes from the economy. The incomes, where do we see them? Yeah, right here. This will be labor remuneration and capital remuneration. And we just sum up all these four numbers in order to get GDP with the income method. Quite simple, straight to the point. And now let's go to the expenditure method, our famous macroeconomic equations. You have everything here written down, what is what, and you just apply this formula. You add all these together, and subtract this one, and you will get the same GDP as well. Okay, and that is actually the input and output matrix. I hope it's clear. Just something to remember. This matrix for sector calculation is only possible, as you can see here. That's the drawback of this matrix. It's only possible for income method and value added method. We cannot use this part in order to calculate only one sector. That's not possible. Why? I actually don't know, just because, and remember this. Okay, that was the input-output matrix. Let's move on to the next part. And just, if I'm too fast, if you have questions, you can ask them now during the presentation, or you can wait till the slide, till we're finished, and then we have a small Q&A session anyway. Okay, let's move on to actually how to measure economic activity. And this means how to interpret or find GDP in different ways and do all of these calculations. And for these, we have actually 4 small subchapters of different aggregates of national accounting. And let's start with the first one that would actually compare national and domestic aggregates. Yeah, exactly. And so just as a disclaimer before, in all of these 4 subcategories, there will be a lot of abbreviations, like for example, GNP, GDP, gross GDP, net GDP, and all of this, they have, in the end, they have all abbreviations. Just be sure for the exam to know them and that you don't get confused and need to figure out first, what is NNP, what is NN? Anyway, just always know what it is. And also something to remember is that income and product, so GDP and GDI, is the same. These are synonyms. There is nothing different about them. It's only another word. In the end, it's the same. Okay. So let's move on with the first one, which would be national versus domestic. So the domestic is what we actually calculated so far. However, the national one is where we add the notion of residency. What does that mean? Well, it actually just means we take our GDP here and we add the NIFA, or the so-called net income factor from abroad balance. So this means actually the labor balance and the capital balances. You will probably encounter these vocabulary in your exam. The labor balance is actually just the labor income that we receive minus the labor income that it will be emitted to the outside to a foreign country. The same also is for capital balance, what we receive, what is emitted. Here in this table, you have some numerical numbers, so employer remuneration received from the rest of the world. So receivable, as we have here, and then here remitted to the rest would be this side, and we have it here, received and remitted. So that would be this thing. And here you have a small explanation for what to add, what to exclude from the national product. And I think this slide is quite self-explanatory. Yeah. Okay, then let's move to the next aggregate, which would be the gross versus the net GDP. Well, okay, the gross aggregate includes all different types of investments. It includes investments for replacement and investments for expansion. However, the net aggregate only includes investments for expansion, because actually, what do we measure with GDP? We measure economic, sorry, I'm missing the word. Economic work.
Activity?
Or Activity. Thank you so much. Yeah, economic activity. And therefore we use only expansion because then something will be expanded and increases everything. And therefore, in order to get from the gross aggregate to the net aggregate, we just take the normal one, so our GDP, and subtract our investment for replacement. Just for the exam, remember investment for replacement is the same as fixed capital consumption is the same as depreciation. These three words are all the same, so don't get confused and remember this, because maybe they use one of them and I don't want you to fall into one of these traps. Yeah, and this can be done for, of course, the national and the domestic product. Here, GNP, you just subtract the investments for replacements and then you have it. Okay, so yeah, there was gross and net, also quite simple, but very important to remember that these are all the same. Okay, now let's go to the real one. Not to the real one, but yeah, good introduction. Let's go to the next one, which would be nominals versus real aggregate. Right. Okay, that's very important to remember. For example, nominal growth includes quantity growth, but also price growth, which means that actually, as you can see here on the example that I made on the right side, here we actually have a bigger GDP in 2020. But does this actually mean that we're better off? Like, GDP will always be most of the time will be written in nominal terms, only if it's specified that it's in real terms. However, here we have nominal terms. But however, does this mean that we're better off? No, it does not, because it actually, the only variation that happens didn't happen here in quantity, where we actually want to measure economic activity. It only happened in price. So it's only due to inflation, right? And that is not what we want. That's not how GDP should actually increase. And therefore, in order to get real GDP, we have to take out this notion of price growth, this notion of inflation. And how do we do these calculations? Actually, for this one, we can use here on the bottom, there are listed the two main calculations for exercises that we will encounter in regard of nominal and real GDP, namely the deflator formula and also the growth formula. So the inflator formula is very simple. It's the implicit deflator is equal to the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100. Just always remember the implicit deflator, so this thing here, you can just plug in actually the price index. So for example, it's 110. This would, if the price index is 110, you can just plug this in here. And then price index is 110. Then this is the nominal. Let's, for example, take this this 330 that I have here, which would be the nominal GDP, divided by the real GDP. I don't know the real GDP, therefore let's just put X, and this times 100, and then we just solve this whole expression in respect to X in order to get the real GDP. I hope this is understandable. Okay, and then the second formula or calculation that we will need here would be the growth rate formula. Very important. Always when they ask you to calculate a difference of growth, always use this formula. It's really just new minus old divided by old times 100. So for example, in this exercise, this would be old, this would be new. So it would be 330 minus the old one, which would be 300. This divided by 300, and then this times 100 would give us the growth rate in percentage. Okay, I think this is also quite clear. Do some exercises for this and you will be good to go. Then we have the last but not least important aggregate for national accounting, which would be the GDP per capita and the labor productivity aggregates, which are actually the per capita aggregates. The main thing here is actually that the GDP per capita, the formula you have given here, it actually just tells us a little bit about the well-being of each individual of an economy. However, well-being is such a widely defined word that you have to predefine it, what well-being is, and we will look at it afterwards a little bit more in depth when we look at the limitation of national accounting, that well-being actually is a very critical term, delicate term to use in this matter. However, that's the main use of GDP per capita. The use of labor productivity, again, you have on top here the formula, how it's calculated. It's actually here in order to see determine if GDP growth comes from more productivity of labor or if there actually are more people employed. So yeah, it's about labor productivity, as the title says. Yeah, that would be the last aggregate of national accounting. So actually now we moved on to the last part of chapter 1, which will be the limits of national accounting. First, we will look at the statistical and conceptual criticism that national accounting actually faces. It's only theory, therefore I won't go into detail with all of them because you have the slides, they are explained there. If you have any questions, of course, you can ask them, but there are 5 limitations concerning statistical, which would be the reliability, of course, of statistics. It might be just that they're bad or incorrect in some countries, which would be, of course, then wrong in the long run. Also, the indirect estimations that are used, so you can't get all the information of every single firm of every country. Therefore, you just take a few and then make estimations, which will in the end, of course, lead to not the 100% correct answer. Next one is underground activities not measured. That doesn't always have to be illegal activities, but only just normal activity that just the firm doesn't report to the authorities. Quantitas with a qualitative aggregate. So that GDP actually doesn't tell you anything about quality, only about quantity. And that's, of course, combined with criticism. And aggregates do not measure wealth. That's the last thing to remember about the limits of national accounting in regard of statistical and conceptual criticism. The next one, we again have some more limits, but this is now looking at the well-being. Because as I told you before, well-being is a delicate word to use here because it needs to be defined. And actually, GDP cannot really measure well-being of an economy. Again, that's just theory, therefore I won't go too long into here. However, just remember that actually GDP is not a real good measure of well-being because well-being is includes so many more things. For example, all these indexes that are important to use, for example, life expectancy, education level, employment rate, and all of this is a very important part of the well-being of an economy and the people that live in it. Okay, so these are the limits, and therefore I would now actually move on to the last part of chapter 1. I already said it before, but actually this is now the last part, which will be the equality distribution of income and therefore the Lorentz curve and the Chine index. Very important thing. Maybe we'll get a calculation exercise as you might have already encountered in your mock midterm exam. So actually, what is this about? The Lorentz curve is the curve that you see. On here, it's the line, or this line actually, because this line here would be the optimal. This would be the optimal Lorentz curve, and it would tell us that income is distributed 100% equally among the population. However, because this is probably not the case and maybe won't ever be the case, the Lorentz curve won't ever be a straight diagonal, but is a curved one. And actually the further away this curve is from the diagonal, the more unequal it is. And the more similar it is to the diagonal curve, the more equal the distribution of income is. However, sometimes when you have to analyze two countries with their Lorenz curves, these Lorenz curves can intercept with each other and like this, and then it's not very clear like which one is now more equal, which one is more unequal. For this one, we would have the Chine index, because the Chine index will measure actually the area between the Lorenz curve and the optimal Lorenz curve, the diagonal curve. And in order to calculate this, I think you all had an exercise in your mock midterm. It's just calculating this area. And then if you have this area, divide this area by 0.5. Never forget that. Always divide it by 0.5. If you forget that, you will get it wrong. And then this area would take a value from 0 to 1. And the more it is closer to 1, the more unequal the distribution is, because of course, then the bigger the area is, and the smaller it is, so the more it is to 0, the more equal the distribution is. So yeah, that was the Lorenz curve and the Chine index. I hope it's quite clear. And yeah, let's move on to chapter 2, our beloved Keynesian model. Okay. Let's start the Keynesian model first with the economic cycle. So on this picture here, you can see the economic cycle that has actually repeated itself over the last years or the last decades for many times. It's always quite similar. There is a peak where it's going up, then it's going down again, going up again. And that's our economy, that's our GDP. However, we as economists, or if some of you want to be economist one day or a counselor for that, their job is, of course, to make these fluctuations as smooth as possible so that it doesn't go up too hard and because always after an up follows a down, and always, yeah, I think it's self-explanatory. And your job is to make this very, very small, just very small. Because then you don't have a huge up, you don't have a huge down, and you, of course, don't want to have a down. Yes, exactly. That's the economic cycle. And the output gap is also a part of the economic cycle. And it's actually the difference from the optimal curve, or from the long run curve, which is the line, to the actually to the actual curve, to the actual GDP. And in order to calculate this, you have again the formula here, or in order to get it in numerical terms, you have this formula. Yeah, that would be the beginning with the economic cycle and the output gap. Hope this is clear. And let's move on to the macroeconomic equilibrium condition. Here we encounter again our so beloved macroeconomic equation, which is y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus z. And it's the same thing, just now we introduce something that is called the disposable income. Disposable income is nothing else than y minus t. And just remember, disposable income is yd. And YD, disposable income, is nothing else than the whole GDP minus T, which is taxes. So GDP minus taxes. Remember that in a country without government, or in a scenario where we have a country without government, there is no tax, of course, because it's always with the tax will always come in combination with government. And in this case, YD is equal to Y. Yeah, just remember that, very important to remember. And yeah, something else that is introduced in this topic or in this slide is the savings functions and the consumption function. Because actually, what are you doing with your disposable income? You have two possibilities what you could do. You can either consume with this money, you can buy food or clothes or whatever, or you can save it. That's all you do with your money in this assumption, in this Keynesian model. These are the only two possibilities. Therefore, YD is also equal to C, consumption plus savings, because that's all you do. And from this new discovery, we can find actually a fourth way to calculate GDP, which would be Y is equal to C plus S plus T. Also a new way to calculate GDP. And also something that we can do now with this new way to calculate GDP, which is plug this one, the Y would be this one, and then we have this, which would be here. We can reshape this in order to get the macroeconomic balances, which would be this one. Very important. These are the macroeconomic balances. I will go further on. I will go more in depth on the next slide, actually. The macroeconomic balances. Here we have three different balances. We have the balance of the private saving. Sorry, I didn't do the highlighter. The balance of the private savings over investment balance. That would be S minus I, savings minus investments. Then we would have the balance of government budget, which would be T minus G, so taxes minus government expenditure. And then we would have the external balances, which would be X, exports minus Z, imports. Okay, so these are the three balances. How do we interpret these? So let's say this balance here is negative. So if this balance here is negative, it means that S is smaller than Y, right? And if S savings is smaller than investment, the balance is negative. And this tells us that actually our savings cannot cover our investments. That's what this tells us. Then for the next one, let's say the balance of government budget is negative. This would tell us that T is smaller than G. This tells us that government expenditure is bigger than taxes, which means that the government spends more money than it actually receives from taxes. Therefore, it's negative as well. And the last balance, the external one, if this one is negative, it would tell us that imports are bigger than exports, and this would tell us that we actually need to import more than we export. Exactly. And these imports will then benefit our economy somehow. Okay. I hope this is clear as well, these balances. Then let's move on to the next part, where we look more in depth about the consumption function. We already had a look at it before, well, really short, just where we introduced the disposable income. Yeah, we introduced it that savings plus consumption would be equal to disposable income. Exactly. But now we have a whole consumption function that consists of C bar, C prime, and of course, disposable income. C bar, I actually cannot draw this little bar, so it's just in brackets C bar, which would be this element, is a constant autonomous consumption. It's actually what we consume no matter how much we actually earn or how much our income is, because we need to consume this amount anyway, otherwise we would die. It's our autonomous consumption. However, where do we get this money from in order to consume? Because we still need to spend money to get food. Well, actually, either you take it from savings, so you have to de-save, or the government helps you somehow. That's how you do it. And then C prime, which is also called the marginal propensity to consume. On the next slide, we will have a look a little bit deeper into this. And the marginal propensity to consume, which is actually how much you consume more with one additional unit of income. or in this case of disposable income. Exactly. That's what this one tells us. And it's always a value between, in Switzerland, it would be between 0.05 and 0.95 because we only have 5 reps and not like in Germany, for example, where they have cents. And therefore, for us, it's always in this range. However, in Germany, it would be between 0.01 and 0.99, or wherever they have euros or anything. Sorry for this ugly writing. Okay, and then we have the last part, which would be disposable income. And as I explained to you before, that in a case where there is no government, we also have no tax, and without tax, YD is just equal to Y. Okay, and as said before, we will have just a short look again more deeper into marginal propensity consume, because it's very important that you never mix up marginal propensity consume with average propensity to consume. Average, as you can see from this small graph, will be the average of the overall YD. So you take the consumption divided by YD. However, marginal propensity consume would be the derivative of the consumption function. So if you take the derivative of this one, this is what we are left with. However, the average would be the total consumption divided by our disposable income. Always remember that. Also, something cool to remember that might be helpful at your exam would be MPC stays the same with income. However, APC will decrease with income. Yeah, and yeah, that's actually all I wanted to say about these two very important little things in the consumption function. Then let's go actually for the next part, which would be the mirroring function of the consumption function. And that would be the savings function, because as we introduced before, what do you do with your disposable income? You either save or you consume. And therefore, what you have left after your consumption, you will save. And therefore, the savings function is nothing else than the consumption function, but mirrored. So that's how it's built up. It's actually just C bar. You just put a minus sign in front of C bar and you get the autonomous savings. And in order to get the marginal propensity to save, so in this case MPS, it's actually just 1 minus C prime or MPC, exactly. And so if, for example, MPC is equal to 0.8, then of course MPS, the marginal propensity to save, would be 1 minus 0.8 and therefore 0.2. Hope it's quite clear. That's how it is. It is what it is, and I think we can move on. Okay, then for this Keynesian model, we actually have to make some assumption from reality that are not necessarily true in reality. So the Keynesian model includes 3 assumptions. The first assumption is that there is no price increase or decrease. So in order that supply and demand are always equal to one another and to keep it constant. The next assumption that we are doing is that inventories that are included in investments act as a buffer. So again, just to keep demand, demand is equal to supply. So just to keep this constant, that we can always buffer if they're unequal, as we can see. This should never happen. And that's why we have this assumption. And the third and very big assumption that we will lose, however, in the next model, but not in our midterm, so happy, would be we don't have any interest rates. However, in the next model, the ISLM, we will have interest rates. However, now we don't. These are just the 3 assumptions. Keep them in mind. Some theory. Okay. Then actually, we move to a very important part for calculations that we will do in our exam anyways, which is the equilibrium product and income. Product or income, because as I told you, GDP or GDI, same thing. Product, income, same thing. Okay, and here we are actually introduced with two new things, which would be Z, well here Z, which is our imports. However, now our Z is not just one single number again. Now it's also depending on GDP. So what you import depends on the income of the country, which actually makes a lot of sense. And then we also introduce taxes. And taxes also now depend on GDP. However, of course, in your exercises, it will be specified if you only have T-bar, so lump sum taxes, which would be taxes that doesn't depend on GDP. This will be all specified in your exercise if it depends on GDP or if not. So this part is always optional. It will be specified in your exam. Okay, that's just a small slide about that. And yeah, then let's move forward in order to find actually the equilibrium now. So I hope you're all familiar with this procedure by now. If not, we can go over it. So we looked at it before. The macroeconomic equilibrium condition, or the macroeconomic equation, would be this one. However, what is new? Before we didn't have this YD and this Y. Before it was just C and Z. However, now we have these. What do we have to do with them? Well, it just makes the equation a little bit more difficult, because in the end we want to have an expression only depending on Y. And now we have here a Y and here a Y. So actually, what do we need to do? We need to solve this equation in respect to Y, so that we get just one Y. The first thing we need to do, let's write out the whole equation. So YD, what is it? It's Y minus taxes. This would be the tax function. So minus the whole thing. And we also have to write out this one, and that's just Z bar minus Z prime times Y. And this is how you expand this whole equation. So first we expand. What do we do then? The third thing is actually we just need to get rid of all these brackets. And it's just simple multiplication. You just multiply C prime with Y, C prime with T bar, C prime with T prime and Y. And then you will get these beautiful constructs. And now, what do we do now? We need to take all the expressions that include a Y to one side. So we need to take this Y, and this Y. So this whole expression, of course, not just the Y, to one side. How do we do that? Well, we subtract this one, we add this one, and we add this one. Because, yeah, and then we have all on one side. Hope this is clear for now. And now we need to, of course, we need to take the Y out of all of these constructs. How we do that? We just can multiply it with Y. We can just take it into brackets. So it would be Y times 1 minus C prime T prime plus Z prime. And now, in order to get everything here onto this side, what do? We divide. So we divide this whole thing here. No, we divide this whole thing here by this one, and then we get this expression. And that's actually the whole procedure. So first expand, afterwards solve the brackets, put every expression with Y on the left side, and then we just take out the Y's and divide. And then we have this expression, which would be the new equilibrium condition, very important. And just to simplify it, the difference between these two is actually only in here, because we know that 1 minus C prime is nothing else than savings S prime, savings prime, as we discussed before in the savings chapter right here. It's the same thing. Okay, so yeah, that's actually how you get to the equilibrium. But now, what does this like? What's the whole thing about this? Well, we can see now, because with the equilibrium, we then can find the impact of fiscal policies or governmental policies on the equilibrium. Fiscal governmental policies are actually just changes in government expenditures or changes in taxes. And the government can either do an expansionary policy, which would result actually in an increase in government expenditure, or a decrease in taxes. It can either do that, or it can do a restrictive fiscal policy, which would be a decrease in governmental expenditures and an increase in taxes. This one, the expansionary fiscal policy, you would actually use when you are in a low phase. So when you're kind of going down and starting hitting rock bottom. So in order to not do that, you would do an expansionary fiscal policies, because by increasing your governmental expenditures, you will automatically as well increase your GDP. And the restrictive policies would happen when the government actually needs to recover from a down from before, like after an expansionary policy will follow a restrictive one, because now it needs to recover and get some money back. Exactly. However, now we need to figure out how do they impact the equilibrium. And that's actually quite easy. We just need to find the multiplier. How do we find the multiplier? This will be on the next slide. But first, let's talk about the multiplier per se. There are actually only two different multipliers, which would be the multiplier for taxes and the multiplier for G, C, Z, I. These are all the same. Just always, it's always better to calculate it for yourself, so that you can be 100% sure that is the correct one. However, here you have the theory about the Canadian multiplier, about leaks. Leaks are S, T, and Z, and there are leaks because they decrease the multiplier. And as you can see, they are written down here. And like if you have them in here, they will increase the bottom half. And if something increases the bottom half of a divide thing, I forgot actually the name, how it's called. This will of course make the whole division smaller. Okay, this will be the theory of the multiplier. You can have a look at it afterwards. As I said, the presentation will be on our website. But now, how do we get our multiplier, which is quite more interesting and more important to know. So actually, how do we do it? The multiplier will be found. You take the GDP plus the change in GDP that will happen due to a change in government expenditure. In the left example here, we would have the change in taxes. And then we would minus this equation by the original one with the GDP. And what you are left with will be the multiplier plus the change. And actually what you will realize, it will always be the front part that will be multiplied with where the change happens. And this will be actually the multiplier. Except you need to think about one thing when you look at the multiplier when it happens with taxes. With taxes, the upper half is different from the normal one. There will be minus Z. That's different, and the main difference actually. because these are actually the two main multipliers that we will use. The one for taxes, just remember, on top will be minus C prime, while here it would be 1. But if we act with Z, if it would be a change in Z, this wouldn't be a 1, it would be a minus 1, because we know Z will be subtracted from the GDP. Yeah, okay. And now how do we find the difference, or something like to remember if you have to look at the difference between a change in government or a change in taxes? Always remember that a change in government is much more effective than a change in T-bar if everything else stays constant, because you have the explanation actually down here. The multiplier is bigger on this side because, as we see, C prime is a number between 0 and 1, but 0 and 1 excluding, and therefore on top it will be never 1, and therefore it will be always smaller. And another reason why tax is actually less efficient is because when you change tax somehow, it's always an indirect effect on GDP. However, when you have government expenditures, you really pump money directly into the economy. Therefore, government is always more effective in what you would like to do. Yeah, okay. These are these two main things compared. I hope this is clear. And let's actually move already to our last chapter of today's recap, which will be the money, something that we all love, of course. Okay, first let's go through some theory again. Theory, we have the free function of money. The free function of money is, firstly, it's a medium of exchange, as you can see. Here, it's a unit of account. In order to compare things, we assign them a value, a money value, and therefore it's so much easier to compare stuff as before when we didn't have it. And it's also a way to store our wealth. These are the free function. Then we have two different kinds of money, actually. We have on one side, we have fiat money, which would be the legal or the legal money, the currency that we have. So the coins and notes that we all have. And we have the scriptural money, which would be the bank money and the money on the deposits. Okay, that's just theory. You have it on the slides. Then next one, the money aggregates. Again, we're still in theory part. We have four different money aggregates. We have M0, which would be the monetary base. And this includes all the currency, all the money that is actually in circulation in the economy. And as well, it includes the sight deposits of commercial banks in the central bank. So it's only regarding commercial banks and the central banks, not us, not we outside of the banking sector. Then what will come in M1, which will be the narrow money stock and the second money aggregate. This aggregate actually includes the currency in circulation, but actually only the money that is in circulation with the public. So only the money that surrounds us. And of course, they include the sight deposits of the non-banking sector, which means our sight deposits, so everything that we deposited on the banks. Then what's included in M1. And now what does it differentiate to M2 and M3 is only actually their liquidity, because M2 is just the M1, so everything that's included in M1 plus savings deposits, which are actually less liquid. We don't know much more about them by now, but they're just less liquid, and it takes more time to get the cash, because here you have the definition of liquidity is actually how quickly you can get your hands on your cash. And then again, the difference to M3 is again less liquid, because here we have the time deposits, which are less liquid than savings deposits, and so on. Again, just some theory about the four main money aggregates. Okay. Then let's move on to the actual money market. So for us, we have first money supply. Money supply for us is now very basic. It's decided by the central bank. So the supply is all decided by the central bank. And therefore it's exogeneously and is actually represented by M1. Not M0, but M1. And that's all that we actually need to know about money supply for now, because we didn't go really deep into who decides really on the money supply and what influences it. Something, however, to remember about money supply, which will also go a little bit deeper in the next slide, is the fact that if the central bank decides to increase the monetary base, and actually wants to increase the money supply, and it increases by 100, the monetary base, which is directly linked to M1. That's something that we also assume right now. M0 and M1 are directly linked. In the end, the money supply will be bigger than only 100. So money supply will increase. And this is all due to the multiplier effect. And this multiplier effect we will look right now on the next slide. I think you're all familiar with this depiction. Maybe it's not very understandable, but we go over it right now. Okay, actually, here we have the central bank. The central bank decides to decrease the rate for deposits. So banks don't have to put so much on their money deposits on the central banks anymore, and therefore I don't have a percentage right now, but let's just say they receive now plus 100. They have to put 100 less on their deposits on the central bank. Therefore, UBS, the commercial bank, receives 100, which is this initial money supply. And therefore, this money will be then supplied from the UBS to a customer. So it gives the customer 100 because he demands it and he wants to use it. Then he takes this 100. However, he decides to use only 20. Either he keeps 20 for himself, which he leaves somewhere around the house, or he goes and buys some stuff. However, then this cycle here on this side will continue somehow, and in the end will end up somewhere on a bank as well. So for now, we can assume maybe he just keeps it in his house. He just keeps it in his pocket. And the other 80 that he has left, he thinks he will deposit it on another bank to maybe get interest or something, or just to save it, and in order not to have it at home. So he deposits 80 in Credit Suisse. Therefore, Credit Suisse receives 80 francs. However, these 80 francs won't just lay around in the treasure of Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse will use this 80 in order to generate some more money or to lend it to someone. However, they can't lend the whole 80. They always have to keep a part on their deposit account. And this deposit account, or the amount that needs to be saved in the Credit Suisse account of customer X, for example, is determined by the central bank. And in this case, this would be 10 francs. This is just a percentage of the 80. And the central bank decides on this. This would be the deposit rate that they have. And it actually just keeps the customer X safe, that if ever he wants to take all of the money out of his account, that Credit Suisse have at least a part of it in their accounts. Because these 10 francs that they have to keep, they won't be touched and they won't leave. And this is just a security that Credit Suisse always have some money in their bank accounts in order to give this back to customer if he demands it. However, the additional 70, they can again supply it. Now customer Y demands 70 francs from Credit Suisse because she needs it for some reason. And now Credit Suisse can supply the 70 to this woman. And therefore we increased initial supply of 100, or like actually this one, of 100 by 70. And therefore in the end we would have a total supply of 170. And this is all due to the multiplier effect. However, this won't be the end of the supply because of course customer Y will continue its journey and she can decide as well, does she want to spend it all on something? And if she spends the 70 on something, the 70 will go into the accounts of maybe Migros because she went grocery shopping, and then Migros will deposit it on the bank and everything. So this will always continue. So this is just a very small picture. And for now, just in this small picture, we just increased it by 70, the supply, but it will always continue. Keep this in mind. Something to remember as well about the money supply is that actually it is two main things that influence the increase of money supply are two factors, which would be the rate of deposits that are determined by the central bank. So this rate, how much commercial banks need to deposit or keep in their deposits, that's one goal, because not one goal, that's one major aspect that influences supply. And the other one is the rate of how much the customer keeps in his pocket. So actually this 20, this rate, these two rates, the rate of deposit and the rate of keeping in his pocket, influence money supply, because these two, this 20 and this 10, these are kind of gone. Like they can't be supplied because they are the 10 can't be supplied because they are fixed. They have to be in the central bank, and the 20 from the customers, the customer has it. So the bank cannot supply it somehow. And I think that's quite clear. So these two rates are very important when looking at supply. Okay. So then after supply, of course, there is also demand, because we will have graphs. And demand, actually, there are three reasons why people demand money on the market, and it's either for transaction purposes, precaution purposes, and speculation purposes. We don't need to know much more about them in depth, because that will be more important afterwards in the ISLM model, but not for us. And these are the three reasons why money is demanded. And a similarity that we can, or two similarities that we already know from only this demand, is that the demand for money is positively linked to GDP, very important, and it's negatively linked to interest rates, which makes total sense, because if interest is high, so actually the price of money, way to say that, but the price of money, if it's high, of course you demand less. That's something we learned in microeconomics. When something has a high price, you demand less of it. And the same is for GDP. When you have more income, of course, you can also make more transactions, or you want to make more transactions, and therefore you demand more money. Very important to remember, will be asked. And now let's combine supply and demand together and create this beautiful graph that we can see here. So here we have the money market equilibrium, where money supply and money demand intercept. And it's actually on the axis for interest. And yeah, and as we said before, the central bank controls supply, and therefore this will somehow affect interest rates. The central bank can decide as well on two different policies. it can either do expansionary monetary policy or restrictive ones. The expansionary means just they supply more money. When they supply more money, it means that interest will go down. And when interest goes down, money demand will increase, because when the price of money is low, you demand more of it. And they have a restrictive money policy where they decrease supply. A decrease in supply will increase interest rates and will decrease in combination then afterwards demand. Yeah, and that's actually all we should need to know about this one. Just a small side note that will also be afterwards important in the ISLM model, but also is included in our midterm, is that investments, so I, is actually depending on interest, which makes total sense, because for investments, which would be, for example, starting a new company, you would also have need much money. And of course, if the price of money is very high, you can't buy so much money, and therefore you also won't invest at that time of moment. However, when interest rates are low, and therefore the price of money is very low, you can demand much of money, you can receive much of money, which you can then afterwards invest. Therefore, this will increase investments. Yeah, that's the last side note. And actually, it was the last slide of the recap. And therefore, I thank you already so much. But first, before ending the session, are there any questions? And yeah, if you would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself so I can hear your beautiful voices and that I have some social interaction today. Yes, Marina?
Hi, firstly, thank you so much for your recap. It was really good. And I just have a question. I have another professor, Professor Devon, and I was thinking whether I can still send you a question or...
Actually, like, you can send it, of course, and I will see if I can answer it. However, there's the disclaimer. I don't know why or economics teacher in general always have to teach different stuff. You can send it to me or in the group chat here, and maybe somebody else from that one's class can help you, or I can help you.
Okay, perfect. I'll just send it, and in case you or somebody else knows it, then it's cool. Otherwise, well, it's okay.
Yeah. Wait, let me just also go here. I would just turn on my lights. It's getting so dark. Oh, there we go. Okay. An economy is exporting 10% of its production, but does not import any goods. For the goods market of this economy to be in equilibrium, the interest rate must be at 2% when GDP equals 400. We also know the following about consumption, where B is the marginal propensity to consume, I is the Canadian multiplier interest 2%. I think I will have to look at this. I will look at it after the session, and I think I will solve it. well, I can solve it. However, I think I need some time, and I don't want to like keep everybody up for too long, but I will send the solutions as well here in this chat so that everybody could have access to it. Is this okay?
That's absolutely perfect. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. Are there any other questions? Yes, Chloe?
Hello. Thank you so much for helping us. I wanted to ask you if you know, when you talked about the assumptions, I wasn't really sure about the one for inventories. I'm not sure to understand what it means.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, inventories. So actually, it's as well about of course, as I told you, it's about making that this won't become reality. That demand and supply will always be equal. So that means like we have inventories that are somehow fictional, and they are included in investments, which is actually not very important at that moment. However, it just tells us, for example, if demand goes up by a lot, and you can't like supply this very fast. And you can't supply this very fast, you have still inventories that are fully stocked in order to equalize the demand that is already there. Because in order to have supply, for example, your production technique, in order to make this very to equalize the demand very fast again, that takes some time. However, you have your inventories that are full, which you can then just take out your stuff and put it into your supply, so that in the end, the demand will be again equal to supply again. And as well, if demand drops, you can just take everything that you produced and put it actually kind of back into your supplies again, inventories again, so that you can take your supply down. That's actually what it tells us. We have inventories, which is, for example, imagine yourself, you have a huge hall where you have put all your goods inside, and if people demand more, you can just take everything out of this hall and in order to increase supply so that this is okay again. And if demand drops, you can just take the additional supply that you have, put it into this hall so that supply goes down again. I hope this helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Marina. Another question. I see a hand. Daniela. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Timo. Thank you so much. It was so good. Thank you. I just have like following Chloe's question. I was wondering, what kind of question do you think that can come regarding inventories? Because in the exercises we did, we never actually used it. So how do you think it could be like in the test, how it can be presented?
I asked him the same thing I asked him about assumptions in general, like what do we need to know for them? And actually, the only way he could answer me, because he couldn't say, yeah, you don't need to know, or something like this, of course, is the only thing. It could be a theory questions where he asks about the assumptions, like which one is true, is this true, is this not true. However, inventories per se won't be asked like one-to-one, I guess. I don't think he will go so much into detail. Or maybe he will ask, how reliable is the Keynesian model? And then you can argue, well, yeah, you don't really can argue because it's not an open-end question. However, how deep he will go in inventories, I wasn't allowed to ask him that as well. So probably just theory question about the assumptions, but I don't think this will be of great interest for him as well. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer this as well because I don't have the answer.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much, Timo.
Okay, so I see there is some reaction in the chat, but I think it's just about, yeah, it's about the question. Perfect. Okay, so I guess there are no further questions. If not, like, you can ask them in this chat, of course, and I will come back to them, or you can, if you have my number or any of my contact details, you can ask me. But I guess you also have other friends. And yeah, I wish you all the best for your exams. Good luck. Thank you very much for your attention, and may your day filled with yay. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.